In the year 1500, most observers would have seen Europe as a fractured, superstitious backwater. But while the great empires of the East chose stability and tradition, Europe did something dangerous. It turned sinful greed into a virtue and dangerous curiosity into a duty. While other civilizations feared disruption, Europe learned to harness it, creating a culture where work wasn't just a chore, it was a calling. This wasn't just economic change, it was a moral revolution. Today, we're uncovering the 5 moral shifts that turned a continent of peasants into a global engine of progress. I'm Victor, and this is Curiosity Matters. In a world where most empires worshipped stability, hierarchy, and obedience, Europe did something different. It turned work into a calling, profit into a duty, and questioning into a virtue. Out of centuries of conflict over sin and virtue, faith and reason, individual duty and collective welfare, it forged what historians sometimes call a moral edge, a culture where discipline and curiosity didn't cancel each other out. They amplified each other. Our discussion today blends cultural history with social and economic insight. We'll look at patterns of work ethic, entrepreneurial values, intellectual freedom, and humanitarian reform, and see how culture shifted from constraint to catalyst. Let's begin with the wider historical context, before unpacking the 5 key advantages, the 5 moral shifts that flowed from this transformation. Before 1500, most great civilizations valued order over change. The purpose of politics and philosophy was to preserve harmony, not to innovate. Emperors claimed divine right, priests guarded sacred tradition, merchants, craftsmen, and early scientists often lived in a grey zone, useful for wealth and war, but morally suspect when they pushed too far. Across much of Eurasia, stability reigned. Confucian scholars in China memorized classical texts to prepare for bureaucratic exams. Ottoman jurists focused on interpreting religious law rather than studying nature systematically. Even in Europe, through much of the Middle Ages, curiosity could sound like a synonym for heresy. By 1700, that moral landscape had flipped in much of Europe. Profit was no longer automatically sinful, but increasingly honorable. Questioning authority could be framed as patriotic rather than treasonous. A merchant in Amsterdam became a citizen to be admired. A scholar in Paris could debate theology, law, or natural philosophy without automatically inviting the gallows. At the core of this transformation lay a moral reorientation. Work, risk, and inquiry turned from vices into virtues. Where many imperial systems tied ethics to obedience and status, Europe increasingly tied virtue to effort and improvement. We can glimpse this in risk behavior and innovation. Urban records and business archives from early modern Europe suggest that a noticeable share of producers, perhaps a quarter in some commercial centers, routinely reinvested profits into new tools, workshops, or ventures. In more centralized empires, commercial initiative often stayed more tightly bounded, channeled through state monopolies or constrained by guilds and religious codes. That difference, modest at first, compounded across generations into what we might call a cultural surplus, a durable pattern of experimentation and adaptation. Patent registers in England by around 1700 list hundreds of filings annually, while official recognition of invention in some contemporary empires remained sporadic and limited to court circles. Catastrophe didn't stop this moral evolution. The 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648 killed millions and devastated huge swaths of Europe. Yet moral debate survived and even deepened. Protestant and Catholic thinkers alike began framing war as a moral failure and peace as progress. From devastation emerged new currents of humanism and reform. That resilience, turning crisis into questioning rather than silence, became one of Europe's distinguishing features. Now, let's break down how this moral and cultural edge developed step by step. The first great advantage was work ethic, the belief that labor itself carried moral meaning. In Christian theology, especially as interpreted over centuries, work evolved from a mere burden after the fall into a path of discipline and redemption. Monasteries became laboratories of time control. Bells divided the day into precise blocks of prayer, reading, and physical labor. When mechanical clocks appeared in medieval Europe, they often crowned monastery towers, transforming time from a natural rhythm into a human instrument. Time became moral. Being late was not just inconvenient, it was negligent. Idleness was not just unproductive, it was spiritually dangerous. Then came the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. Reformers such as John Calvin reframed worldly success. For some communities shaped by these ideas, industriousness and reliability became signs that one belonged among the elect. Profit, if earned through honest work and reinvested prudently, was no longer automatically suspect. It could be read as evidence of calling. Contrast that with dominant imperial norms elsewhere. Confucian tradition emphasized balance, hierarchy, and social harmony. Merchants were often ranked below scholar officials and landowners. In many Islamic interpretations, certain forms of speculation and profit-seeking could be viewed with suspicion, especially when they smelled of gambling or usury. Labor was honorable, but aggressive worldly gain always flirted with moral danger. Europe's evolving ethic told believers something different. Count your hours, use your talents, improve your station. Clocks marched from monasteries to city halls and workshops. Schedules regulated both devotion and production. The later saying, "Time is money," distilled an emerging worldview where wasted time was wasted virtue. By around 1600, regions shaped strongly by this ethic, often in northern Protestant Europe but also in some dynamic Catholic areas, were already seeing faster gains in productivity and craft specialization than many of their contemporaries. Calendars, hourglasses, and ledgers became more than tools. They were instruments of salvation and self-respect. The message, put simply, was revolutionary. You honor God and community by improving the world through your work. Labor ceased to be mere drudgery, it became destiny. The second cultural advantage was the rehabilitation of profit, the idea that making money could serve virtue, not vice. For centuries, from antiquity through the High Middle Ages, lending at interest was widely condemned under the heading of usury. Wealth was to be enjoyed sparingly, shared charitably, and pursued with extreme caution. But Europe's commercial revival after 1200, coupled with its patchwork of competing city-states and kingdoms, slowly softened those prohibitions. Merchant republics such as Venice and Florence developed sophisticated financial practices. Double-entry bookkeeping, a ledger system balancing debits and credits, was both mathematical discipline and moral metaphor. A balanced account symbolized an honest merchant. By the 1500s, churches themselves held investments. Cathedrals rose not only from donations, but also from partnerships with banking houses. Charitable institutions learned to preserve and grow endowments through trade and credit. In other regions, tighter moral and legal restraints persisted. In many Islamic jurisdictions, profit-sharing partnerships were known and used, but interest-bearing loans remained heavily constrained. In imperial China, merchants often remained low in the social hierarchy, frequently targeted by special levies or restrictions on landholding. Europe's moral shift changed the calculus. Profit became a measure of trust and competence. Joint stock companies appeared, allowing thousands of smaller investors to pool capital and spread risk. The Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company, and others financed voyages and ventures that reshaped global trade. This rebranding of profit had powerful side effects. It encouraged transparency, written contracts, and calculated risk-taking. Investors demanded records, audits, and predictable rules. Partnerships that succeeded could be imitated. Those that failed became cautionary tales rather than moral scandals. Whether in maritime ventures or domestic enterprises, the emerging ethical message was consistent. Diligence plus prudence equals virtue. Europe turned ambition from a private temptation into a semi-public service. The third pillar of Europe's moral transformation was a growing tolerance for failure, and a culture that increasingly treated experimentation as learning, not sin. In much of the medieval world, knowledge meant preserving what authoritative texts had declared. Scripture, Aristotle, revered commentators. Innovation as contradiction could look like arrogance, even blasphemy. From the 1500s onward, a slow but profound shift took root. Knowledge began to mean testing, observing, measuring, verifying. This wasn't only a methodological turn, it was a moral one. To investigate creation carefully could be framed as honoring the creator. Universities widened their curricula. Mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy slowly gained space beside theology and law. Galileo's experiments, whether or not he actually dropped balls from the Tower of Pisa, symbolized a deeper change. Evidence might challenge tradition and still be defended as a higher kind of piety. Scientific societies crystallized this ethos. The Royal Society in London, founded in 1660, adopted the motto nullius in verba, take no one's word for it. Truth demanded replication and scrutiny. Doubt became a tool, not a sin. Many imperial systems, by contrast, continued to prize harmony over confrontation. Chinese scholar officials were trained to master the canon and maintain order, not to overturn accepted views of nature. Ottoman jurists guarded orthodoxy in law and theology. Deviating too far risked disgrace or worse. Europe's political and religious fragmentation created escape routes. A thinker silenced in one jurisdiction could flee to another more tolerant city. The diversity that fractured Christendom often amplified creativity. Results showed up everywhere, from agriculture to engineering. Experimenters tried new crops, breeding methods, and drainage techniques. Printed pamphlets spread both successes and failures quickly. Missteps were no longer purely shameful, they were part of a shared learning curve. Cultural permission to question, more than any single invention, made scientific and technical progress sustainable. Europe was not the only place where people experimented, but it became one of the few where curiosity itself gained institutional protection. The fourth advantage was political and moral balance, the uneasy split between church and state that opened space for independent thinking. In many empires, ruler and religion merged. The Chinese emperor was the son of heaven. Loyalty to the throne carried cosmological weight. The Ottoman Sultan held religious authority as caliph. Doubting the ruler could blur into doubting the divine order. Europe's pattern diverged early. The investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries pitted pope against emperor over who could appoint bishops. The outcome was messy and incomplete, but culturally decisive. Spiritual and temporal power remained in tension rather than merging completely. Later, the Reformation further fragmented religious authority. Lutheran, Reformed, Anglican and Catholic churches competed vigorously for believers. That very rivalry produced an unexpected side effect, pockets of relative tolerance where minority groups or controversial thinkers could find refuge. By the 1600s, philosophers such as John Locke could argue that legitimate government depended on consent, that conscience deserved protection, and that rulers should be limited by law. Voltaire and Montesquieu would later criticize both church and state, appealing to a wider moral community rather than any single institution. Europe's friction between altar and throne created a creative tension. Universities might be funded by cities or princes rather than bishops. Printers could shift operations across borders. Coffeehouses, salons, and learned societies emerged as semi-independent spaces where ideas could circulate and collide. Out of that pluralism grew a core principle of modernity. No idea is beyond scrutiny. Freedom of conscience gradually extended to freedom of inquiry. The moral right to think differently became the engine of intellectual diversity. The fifth and final advantage was a growing moral obligation to improve lives, the belief that progress itself could be an ethical duty. After the Black Death in the 14th century wiped out huge shares of Europe's population, elites and commoners alike had to rebuild. Guilds founded hospitals and almshouses. Towns took pride in caring for widows, orphans, and the poor. Charity became both religious obligation and civic identity. By the Enlightenment, these local obligations had expanded into social philosophy. Improving sanitation, public health, and education was recast as proof of a civilized society. Physicians, engineers, and reformers increasingly described their work as service. Edward Jenner's early vaccination experiments, for example, were framed not just as clever science, but as a moral effort to prevent suffering. Campaigns against the slave trade and slavery itself drew on religious conviction and humanitarian ideals. In many imperial settings, welfare remained tied primarily to order. Relief was granted to prevent unrest or as an act of rulerly benevolence, not as a right. Europe's moral evolution moved toward a different standard. A ruler who failed to protect subjects could be judged not only ineffective, but unjust. Technological change followed that logic. Drainage systems and pumps were justified as measures to protect miners and farmers as well as profits. Urban infrastructure, sewers, paved roads, lighting could be defended on both economic and moral grounds. Early economic thinkers began to merge ethics and utility, arguing that a prosperous, educated, and healthier population was a legitimate objective of policy. By the 1700s, the link between conscience, usefulness, and innovation had become self-reinforcing. Europeans increasingly viewed efforts to improve material conditions not as moral compromises, but as moral commitments. None of this means Europe was uniquely virtuous or that other civilizations lacked dynamism. Song Dynasty China, centuries earlier, had celebrated certain forms of commerce and had developed complex markets. The Ottoman Empire pioneered the use of gunpowder weapons and practiced forms of religious toleration that many European states did not match until much later. What made Europe distinctive in the long run was not a monopoly on good ideas, but a particular mix: discipline without total paralysis, belief without rigid uniformity, ambition channeled through institutions that could survive criticism. Modern echoes are easy to spot. The entrepreneurial culture of today's innovation hubs, the Nordic blend of markets and welfare, debates over ethical investing and sustainable business, all trace back, in part, to this moral heritage of balancing profit with principle, curiosity with conscience. The underlying rule hasn't changed much. Cultures that encourage hard work, reward responsible risk, allow authority to be questioned, and see welfare as shared responsibility tend to generate more innovation over time. Societies that sanctify hierarchy and suppress disagreement may enjoy stability, but often at the price of adaptability. The moral edge that once powered cathedrals, guilds, and workshops now drives laboratories, startups, and social movements. Ethical curiosity, the conviction that we should understand and improve the world, remains one of civilization's greatest assets. To sum up, Europe's cultural and moral advantage rested on 5 interlinked forces: a disciplined work ethic that sanctified labor and time, a moral acceptance of profit as a potential social good, a culture that treated failure and experiment as pathways to truth, a lasting, if uneasy, balance between church and state that protected free thought, and a belief that improving human welfare was not indulgence, but duty. Together, these values transformed moral struggle into material strength. They made experiment respectable, ambition ethical, and compassion productive. Culture, often invisible in statistics, became Europe's quiet engine of progress. Thank you for joining this exploration on Curiosity Matters. Subscribe and join our community for more deep dives into the hidden engines of history, where morality, ingenuity, and human choice reshape the world we live in. And stay curious.